Well, today in Georgia, NBC's Blaine Alexander conducted what is simply the single most important interview ever conducted about a criminal investigation of Donald Trump. We have occasionally seen interviews with jurors after they have returned verdicts in criminal trials. I have conducted interviews like that. I had one of the jurors in the Paul Manafort case on this program after she found Paul Manafort guilty. She was a Trump voter who told us that she took her oath to do her duty and did her duty. That was one of the more extraordinary juror interviews I've ever seen. Juror interviews are not common. Most members of juries in most trials never speak to the press. I have never seen an interview with a member of a grand jury before that grand jury's work has been made public. In fact, even after a grand jury's work has been made public, I don't ever recall seeing a grand jury member in a television interview. Today, 30-year-old Emily Kohrs, the foreperson of the Fulton County Grand Jury in Georgia that has been investigating possible election crimes possibly committed by Donald Trump and his associates, began her day doing a short interview with the Associated Press. It was possible for reporters to track down Emily Kohrs because, as the foreperson of the grand jury, her name was included on subpoenas issued by the grand jury. She told the Associated Press that she volunteered to be the foreperson of the grand jury. Then, in a short interview with the New York Times, she said that the grand jury did recommend indictments of several people. She said, quote, "It's not a short list." That's what she told the New York Times then. Emily Kohrs sat with NBC's Blaine Alexander for an extraordinary 42-minute interview, which was interrupted briefly more than once by the noise of the geese in the background of her location in Georgia. She told Blaine Alexander that she and the grand jury recommended the indictment of more than a dozen people.
And so we're talking about multiple people.
Yes.
How many people? Was this a long list?
It's not a short list.
So we're talking about more than a dozen people?
I would say that, yes.
Okay. Are these recognizable names, names that people would know?
There are certainly names that you would recognize, yes. There are names also that you might not recognize, or there are names that, like, you might recognize as someone who's followed this case, but then, you know, your mother might not recognize because she doesn't care about the intricacies of the case. But there definitely are some names that you expect.
Did the grand jury recommend an indictment of former President Trump?
I'm not going to speak on exact indictments.
Would we be surprised? Are there bombshells of who is being recommended for indictment?
I don't think that there are any giant plot twists coming. I don't think that there are any, like, giant, that's not the way I expected this to go at all. I don't think that's in store for anyone.
So nothing that would surprise people who have been following this?
Probably not. I wouldn't want to characterize anyone else's reaction, of course, but so that was when we heard a lot in testimony. But probably not. It probably wouldn't shock you. I would not expect you to be too shocked, no.
And that includes of the former president, potentially?
Potentially. It might.
Okay. You're looking at a 30-year-old grand jury foreperson who's never done a television interview before. Don't expect her to be polished, and don't expect her to behave necessarily the same way she would if she were in this studio under these lights in this stiffer environment. She's in a place where she's very comfortable. She's being relaxed in the way she has her exchanges with Blaine Alexander. And so this interview does not have the feel that you might expect in this kind of interview. Emily Kohrs explained why the grand jury did not subpoena Donald Trump.
I think that there were a lot of people that we could have subpoenaed, and there are a lot of people that we honestly, like, might have subpoenaed, but there was also, I don't know, partially the time factor. Like, if we had subpoenaed everyone who had potentially something to say about this, we would probably be there for 2 years. You know what I mean? Like, there are just so many people involved. And I think at some point through this investigation, especially as we began to speak to higher profile witnesses, I think some of the combativeness that we experienced meant that the DA's team, as well as us, kind of started to pick our battles. And when someone, like, for example, goes before the January 6th committee and says they plead the fifth 200 times, do you really expect them to come before you and say something different? You know what I mean? And so it became a battle we didn't need to fight when we could fight other battles and make way with those.
Sure. Did you personally want to hear from the former president?
I wanted to hear from the former president, but honestly, I kind of wanted to subpoena the former president because I got to swear everybody in. And so I thought it'd be really cool to get 60 seconds with President Trump of me looking at him and being like, do you solemnly swear? And me getting to swear him in. I kind of just thought that would be an awesome moment. I can see how trying to get the former president to come talk to us would have been a year in negotiation by itself.
So it sounds like that was ultimately a battle that you all decided not to wage.
Exactly. That's kind of how it ended up, was that. And I'd be fascinated by what he said, but do you think he would have come in and said anything groundbreaking, or just the same kind of thing we've heard? So at some point, you don't need to hear 50 people say the same thing. You know what I mean? At some point, you kind of start to get the gist.
Sure.
That sounds like it might mean, I stress might, that the grand jurors had heard enough in other evidence from Donald Trump and about Donald Trump that they had an idea of what to expect if Donald Trump testified, and that testimony would be unlikely to change the grand jury's perception of the case. Now, to be clear, that is only one possible interpretation of what you just heard Emily Kohrs say. I want to continue to let her speak for herself as she makes the choices about what she feels she can say, while you see her simultaneously making choices about what she thinks she should not say. Blayne Alexander asked Emily Kohrs about immunity deals for witnesses.
How many people came into the room to testify with immunity deals already in place?
Maybe a dozen, maybe.
Were these high-level people?
I don't think you would recognize any of the names.
Any of them members of the former president's inner circle?
Like I said, I don't think you recognize any of the names.
Okay. Were there people who were offered immunity once they got into the room?
We only, to the best of my recollection, we only saw that once.
What was the situation? Why was that person offered immunity?
I'm sorry, I'm making sure that I don't break any of my rules. We saw someone be or receive an offer of immunity because, how can I put that best? While he was testifying, while people were testifying, anyone, we often hit areas where they would begin to plead the fifth, right? And the lawyers would kind of test the water and then be like, okay, so can I mark out that you would plead the fifth in response to any questions about X situation? You know, kind of mark out the spot. And one of those times that they said, oh, okay, you're going to plead the fifth in answer to any questions about the situation. And he said, yes. That was then followed by, would your answer change if we discussed immunity?
Sure.
And he said yes. And so then every counsel left the room. We went off the record for a while. We were not privy to counsel discussions. That's between them. So they left the room and had a more detailed discussion. And when they came back, we had another conversation about topics that we previously hadn't.
Was this a high-level witness? Was this a recognizable name?
Probably not.
Okay.
I don't think my dad would know who it was.
Were the people?
It's a good reference point.
Sure. Were there any members of the former president's family or any other
No.
members? None of his.
I've never met a member of the Trump family.